Hi, I'm Heather Karuba. Thanks for coming and listening to my talk. I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers of the symposium, in particular Joshua Leffler, for the invitation to speak today. Today I'm going to talk about a project that Lizzie and I have been working on for a few years. Our motivation, like many others, is to predict when and how phenological mismatch will occur due to climate change. And today specifically, I'll be talking about trophic mismatch. So we know that climate change is causing phenological shifts, and we know these shifts vary across species, between functional groups, and trophic levels. Such variation has led to changes in the relative timing of key activities among interacting species. A few years ago, we demonstrated that the relative timing of pairwise interactions, both trophic and non-trophic, has changed by 6.1 days per decade over recent decades, suggesting that climate change is leading to shifts in the relative timing of species interactions, or in other words, shifts in phenological synchrony. What we don't know is when these shifts are going to lead to negative fitness consequences. It appears that sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. One of the key relationships to predicting when there will be fitness consequences due to shifts in phenological synchrony is the relationship between fitness and relative timing. On this slide, I'm showing two different case studies, one showing a strong relationship and the other showing no relationship. So on the left-hand side is the relationship between individual fitness of roe deer in France and the relative timing between the timing of births and spring plant phenology. And as you can see, there's a really strong relationship, such that individual fitness is highest when peak overlap occurs between the timing of births and the timing of plant availability. Uh, on the right-hand side is a relationship, or sorry, is looking at the a case study of a great tit in the Netherlands, looking at the relationship between population growth of the great tit and the relative timing between timing of breeding and caterpillar biomass. And as you can see, there is no relationship between the two. So in this case, we would not predict that shifts in phenological synchrony or shifts in relative timing would lead to population growth. Whereas in the case in France with the roe deer, we would expect shifts in synchrony to occur if there were shifts in the relative timing of that interaction. So it's unclear why there's so much variation in these relationships and how we can expect to predict shifts in shifts, fitness consequences due to shifts in synchrony. And so we argue that this is because there's a disconnect between ecological theory and current empirical approaches. And we argue that there's two key reasons that make it difficult to determine whether a key hypothesis in this field is widely supported in the context of climate change. So specifically, these are take-home messages, but we focus on the widely cited Cushing mismatch hypothesis, which is the most commonly applied hypothesis concerning consumer resource interactions in this literature. And we show, so our first take-home message is that this hypothesis is poorly tested in the current literature. And the second aspect that makes it difficult to anticipate how climate change is going to affect ecological consequences due to shifts in phenological synchrony is that studies are not defining a pre-climate change baseline, which we'll talk about why that's important, or which I'll talk about in a minute. So to start off with, I'll just give a brief overview of the Cushing hypothesis. And it basically predicts that there is a match when the timing of peak food requirement is at the same time as the peak food availability, which is the figure in the middle. Whereas a mismatch occurs when there's a gap in timing between the food requirement and the food availability. So that occurs in the left and the right panel. So that could occur because the consumer emerges before the resource or the consumer emerges after the peak resource. And in our definition of fitness of the Cushing hypothesis, which along with other studies includes fitness requirement or fitness, the relationship with fitness, such that fitness is highest when the peak food requirement is at the same time as peak food availability. And that mismatch occurs when there's a gap between food requirement and food availability, which leads to a decrease in fitness in either direction. This hypothesis has two key assumptions. The first is that consumer fitness is most determined by the resource. And the second is that consumer and resource show aspects of seasonality. So, and primarily it's important that the resource has only a certain amount of time during the year where that resource is available. Again, so there's some seasonality to it. One key aspect is the fact that multiple mechanisms can produce the Cushing hypothesis. So they can vary across space, systems, and even time. So mechanisms from the life history theory and food web dynamics can all produce the curve. For example, trade-offs between fecundity and mortality or different breeding strategies can all produce this relationship, where consumers are maximizing their fitness through ideal timing with the peak of their primary resource. So a direct, strong test of this hypothesis would be one that clearly tests the assumptions and that tests multiple potential mechanisms. So we need data that, again, tests assumptions and mechanisms. So the gold standard of a study would be one that has equivalent data assessed for both the consumer and the resource, and at the level of the individual when possible, so that mechanisms can be tested from both food web theory and life history theory. So again, this is really the gold star of what we would be hoping for. So what we did was we looked through the literature to see how often this is the case. And we found 42 studies with 45 pairwise species interactions. We found a pretty good mix between aquatic and terrestrial studies. And in terms of the taxonomic group of the consumer, the highest number of consumers were birds, but there was also a lot of invertebrates and then also fish and mammals. So quite a diverse group of consumers. So when we looked through the pairwise interactions, in terms of looking at this gold standard criteria, we found actually that none of the pairwise interactions we found had individual level data for both the consumer and resource. So there wasn't a single study that met all of these requirements. We found only one interaction that had per capita performance on the resource, so only 1 out of 45 interactions. We found that when researchers measure population or community level on the consumer, they are also collecting equivalent data on the resource and consumer. But again, that this is never per capita data. So basically what's happening is that the data required to provide strong tests of this hypothesis is non-existent in this literature. And so the problem with this is that researchers are only testing one piece of the much larger field of mechanisms that could underlie the curve. So it's highly possible that multiple mechanisms explain many of these systems, but that data limitations make it hard to assess the mechanisms related to multiple theories at once. So again, most of these studies are not actually providing strong tests of the hypothesis. So it'll be difficult to refute the hypothesis if no evidence is found. The second aspect or area that makes it difficult to predict how shifts in phenological synchrony are going to relate to fitness consequences in the context of climate change is that researchers still need an understanding of the system dynamics before climate change so that we can make these predictions. So it's more than just testing the assumptions and underlying mechanisms of this one hypothesis. We need to have an understanding of the dynamics before climate change began. Specifically, when I say pre-climate change baseline, what I mean is looking at or considering the range of natural variation before the early 1980s, which is really when recent climate change began. So again, we went back to the studies in our database and looked to see how many studies began before the early 1980s. And actually, only 30% of the studies had data from some number of years before the early 1980s. And looking at these studies, there were only 3 or 4 studies that had data from multiple years from before the early 1980s, and that these studies actually defined a pre-climate change baseline. So there's a very small proportion of studies that are doing this. So one of the major implications of not defining a baseline is that studies are essentially confounding a pre-climate change baseline with the peak of the Cushing curve. So that's what I'm showing on the top, which is this purple dot. So essentially you're assuming that fitness was highest before climate change began because the consumer's timing was well matched with the resource. Again, so we're assuming that there's a synchrony baseline. The resulting prediction is that climate change will necessarily change the relative timing of the interaction, leading to a decline in consumers' fitness, which you can see in the red with the red arrows on the top curve. So the effect of climate change, again, is to decrease fitness because you're assuming that pre-climate change that there was a synchrony baseline. But without knowledge of the pre-climate change baseline, it is difficult to predict the direction and magnitude of fitness consequences due to climate change driven shifts. So another hypothesis, so there's an alternative hypothesis called the adaptive mismatch hypothesis, and you can see that as the second curve on the top panel with a weaker relationship or with a weaker curve, the blue dot there. And so the relationship or the changes in fitness might be a lot less in magnitude if that hypothesis is supported. Alternatively, there's other scenarios like the asynchrony baseline. So if these relationships were not in synchrony before climate change, which you can see on the bottom panel with the green dot, then essentially your predictions about how fitness are going to change are going to be quite different than if you were at a synchrony baseline. So, in conclusion, two take-home messages is that the main theory in this literature, the Cushing match-mismatch hypothesis, is being poorly tested. And the second is that very few studies are defining a pre-climate change baseline, which is making it difficult to predict how fitness will change due to climate change-driven shifts in phenological synchrony. So, in order to move the field of phenological mismatch forward, so again, from moving from documentation towards forecasting, requires higher quality data that enables the testing of fundamental hypotheses and defining of key baselines. So we suggest in order to move the field forward that a sort of gold standard approach would be one that integrates the long-term pre-climate change data and an experimental approach in a single system. Of course, in the absence of long-term data, which we can't avoid, or it's hard to replicate, um, taking advantage of spatial gradients and climatic conditions, and then again, integrating that with an experimental study can provide a powerful approach to test multiple hypotheses. We suggest also, again, that experiments are helpful to test multiple different mechanisms, that higher temporal resolution data in some systems would help to tease apart different mechanisms and potentially testing the assumptions of the hypothesis. And that finally, whenever possible, to begin testing alternative hypotheses, because this is so rarely done in this literature. So with that, I would encourage you, or thank you for listening, and I would encourage you, if you are interested to learn more, um, to see our recent paper in Nature Climate Change. The citation is there, and then there's a few people we had to thank that again are listed in this paper. And thank you for listening.